Every generation believes their system is different. Every society insists their institutions are too sophisticated to fail. And every single time, reality proves them catastrophically wrong. From Weimar Germany to Zimbabwe, from Argentina to Venezuela, people have watched their paychecks become worthless, their bank accounts evaporate, and their retirement plans destroyed by systems that promise security. Financial collapse isn't an exception. It's a recurring pattern. The real question isn't if systems break. It's what actually survives when they do. The myth of stability is the costliest delusion in history. We trust our retirement accounts, our government bonds, our national currencies, assuming they represent permanent value. But value isn't permanent. It's conditional. And those conditions can reverse faster than most people can react. That's why studying collapse is so critical and so uncomfortable. Every breakdown reveals what truly holds worth and what dissolves into nothing. And if you examine the evidence honestly, you'll discover that the survivors weren't the most loyal citizens. They were the most skeptical ones. Consider Weimar Germany. In 1914, the German mark was one of the world's most respected currencies, backed by the industrial might of Europe's strongest economy. But World War I changed everything. The government, desperate to fund a losing war, began printing currency without restraint. At first, the inflation seemed manageable. Then it accelerated. By 1923, hyperinflation had reached levels that still seem impossible. Prices doubled every few days. Workers demanded payment twice daily because their morning wages would be worthless by afternoon. A loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January 1923 cost 200 billion marks by November. Life savings accumulated over decades became insufficient to buy a single meal. Pensions became cruel jokes. The middle class, Germany's backbone, was financially annihilated. But here's what history often overlooks. Not everyone was destroyed. Those who recognized the pattern early converted marks in a foreign currency, gold, or real estate. Farmers with food had leverage. Craftsmen with skills could barter. The wealthy with assets abroad preserved their wealth. Meanwhile, the compliant savers who trusted the system most suffered the worst losses. That's the brutal first lesson. Loyalty to failing currency destroys wealth faster than any external enemy. And when trust collapses, only tangible assets retain meaning. But collapse doesn't always announce itself with obvious hyperinflation. Sometimes it arrives through contagion that spreads before anyone understands what's happening. In 1929, the American stock market didn't just correct. It shattered. On Black Tuesday, October 29th, panic selling erased fortunes. But the real devastation came afterward. Banks failed by the thousands. Depositors lost everything, not through theft or fraud, but through institutional collapse. The banks simply didn't have the money. Families discovered their life savings had vanished, not into someone else's pocket, but into thin air. The economy contracted by nearly 30%. Unemployment reached 25%. Breadlines stretched for blocks. The Dust Bowl compounded agricultural collapse. And for a decade, the wealthiest nation on earth became a laboratory for economic suffering. Yet even in that catastrophe, patterns emerged. Those who had diversified before the crash, holding gold, land, or foreign assets, survived better. Those who maintained liquidity could buy property and businesses at depression prices. Those with practical skills, construction, repair, farming, found work when white-collar professionals starved. The Great Depression taught a lesson most Americans have forgotten. Institutional failure isn't theoretical. It's recurring. And survival belongs not to those who trust the system most deeply, but to those who prepare for its failure. If collapse through inflation and banking failure weren't enough, history also shows us how currency controls can trap entire populations. In the Soviet Union's final years, the ruble was theoretically valuable within the country, but was worthless outside. Citizens couldn't convert rubles to dollars. They couldn't move money abroad. They couldn't protect themselves from the obvious coming collapse. When the USSR finally disintegrated in 1991, the ruble crashed. Pensions evaporated. Savings became meaningless. An entire generation that had worked their lives under socialism discovered their decades of savings couldn't buy basic necessities. Who survived? The black market operators who had accumulated dollars and foreign goods. The apparatchiks who had connections abroad. The criminals who understood that state promises were fiction. The honest, loyal Soviet citizens who had saved rubles and trusted the system were economically annihilated. The lesson is uncomfortable but undeniable. Currency controls are a trap designed to lock you inside a sinking ship. And when governments restrict your ability to move wealth, it's because they know the collapse is coming. While the Soviet collapse showed the danger of currency controls, Argentina demonstrated that collapse isn't a one-time event. It's a cycle nations can repeat endlessly. Argentina defaulted on its debt in 2001, freezing bank accounts and converting dollar deposits into devalued pesos at government-imposed rates. Citizens lost 70% of their savings overnight. Protests erupted. The government changed hands multiple times. And yet, 20 years later, Argentina faces the same crisis again. Inflation regularly exceeds 100% annually. The peso loses value constantly. Every few years, the government introduces a new currency, hoping to reset confidence. And every time, the same people suffer. Savers holding pesos, workers paid in local currency, retirees dependent on government pensions. Meanwhile, those who keep wealth in dollars, real estate, or foreign accounts weather each crisis. The pattern is so predictable that Argentinians have developed their own strategies. Black market currency exchange, informal dollar savings, property investment as inflation hedge. They've learned through repeated collapse what textbooks refuse to teach. Official currency is a trap when institutions are corrupt or incompetent. If this sounds distant, remember that within living memory, multiple developed nations have experienced versions of this. Iceland's banking system collapsed in 2008. Cyprus confiscated depositor funds in 2013. Greece imposed capital controls in 2015. These weren't developing economies. They were Western democracies whose citizens believed their systems were secure. The survivors in each case weren't the most trusting. They were the ones who diversified before the crisis or moved money abroad before controls were imposed. Moving from currency collapse to a different kind of devastation, the 2008 global financial crisis revealed how modern finance can destroy wealth without touching physical currency. The crisis began with American mortgage-backed securities, complex financial instruments that spread risk across the entire global banking system. When housing prices stopped rising and subprime mortgages defaulted, the whole structure collapsed. Banks worldwide faced insolvency. Credit markets froze. Stock markets crashed. Unemployment soared. Governments intervened with trillions in bailouts, not to help ordinary citizens, but to prevent institutional collapse. And here's the critical part. The people who caused the crisis weren't punished. They were rescued. Banks received government funds. Executives kept their bonuses. Meanwhile, ordinary homeowners lost their houses. Retirement accounts were decimated. Unemployment destroyed careers and families. The crisis transferred wealth upward on a scale rarely seen in peacetime. Those connected to the institutions that failed received protection. Those dependent on wages and savings bore the losses. What protected people in 2008? Not loyalty to the system. Not trust in institutions. Those who survived best had diversified investments, minimal debt, or access to opportunities during the collapse. When housing crashed, those with liquidity bought property at depression prices. When stocks bottomed, those with cash accumulated assets. By 2023, American wealth inequality had reached levels not seen since the 1920s, a direct consequence of who was protected during the crisis and who wasn't. The lesson repeats across every collapse. Institutions protect themselves first. Your loyalty to them will not be reciprocated. Moving to more recent history, Venezuela shows how quickly a wealthy nation can descend into economic catastrophe. In the early 2000s, Venezuela had the world's largest proven oil reserves and a relatively prosperous population. 20 years later, it's a humanitarian disaster. The government, dependent on oil revenue and unable to adapt when prices fell, printed money to cover deficits. Inflation accelerated into hyperinflation. By 2018, annual inflation exceeded 1 million%. Prices changed hourly. Salaries became worthless within days. Stores emptied. Medicine disappeared. Millions fled the country. For those who stayed, survival required abandoning the bolivar entirely. Venezuelans transitioned to dollars, barter, cryptocurrency, anything except the official currency. Those who had saved in bolivars lost everything. Those who had foreign currency, gold, or portable skills could emigrate or survive. Those stuck holding government promises starved. Venezuela's collapse is still ongoing. And the lesson is stark. Even resource-rich nations with educated populations can experience total economic breakdown when governance fails and institutions prioritize ideology over reality. No amount of natural wealth protects you if the system managing it is broken. And proximity to collapse doesn't require traveling to Venezuela. It's happening inside developed economies right now, just slower and less visibly. In Japan, decades of deflation and stagnant growth have created a generation that has never experienced prosperity. In Southern Europe, youth unemployment remains above 30% in some regions, a lost generation sacrificed to currency union constraints. In the United States, real wages for most workers haven't increased in 50 years while asset prices have exploded, creating a wealth gap that resembles pre-revolutionary France more than a healthy democracy. These aren't sudden collapses. They're slow-motion transfers. From labor to capital. From the young to the old. From the many to the few. The mechanism is different, but the result is identical. Ordinary people holding ordinary jobs with ordinary savings lose ground every year, while those holding assets, real estate, stocks, businesses accumulate wealth. The collapse is already underway. It's just moving slowly enough that most people don't recognize it as collapse. They see it as normal economic difficulty. But the trajectory is clear. And when the next shock arrives, whether pandemic, war, financial crisis, or climate disaster, those already fragile will break entirely. So what actually protects you when systems fail? History provides answers, but they're not comforting. In Weimar Germany, it was foreign currency and real assets. During the Depression, it was liquidity and practical skills. In the Soviet collapse, it was black market access and foreign connections. In Argentina, it's perpetual currency hedging and inflation-resistant assets. In 2008, it was having wealth before the crisis to buy during it. In Venezuela, it was the ability to leave. The strategies vary, but the underlying principle is constant. Survival comes from recognizing that official promises are conditional and planning for their failure. And here's the pattern most people refuse to see. Collapse rewards the prepared and punishes the trusting. That's not moral. It's not fair. It's structural. When currencies fail, those holding real assets survive. When banks collapse, those with diversified holdings endure. When governments impose controls, those who moved wealth early escape. The people destroyed in every collapse aren't the reckless or the foolish. They're the loyal ones. The ones who believe the promises. The ones who saved in local currency, trusted the banks, and assumed the system would protect them. History shows that assumption is fatal. But protection isn't just defensive. It's opportunistic. Every collapse creates opportunities for those positioned to seize them. After Weimar's hyperinflation, those with hard currency bought property from desperate sellers at fractions of real value. After the Depression, patient investors acquired businesses that later became Fortune 500 companies. After 2008, cash buyers purchased homes that appreciated enormously. Collapse transfers wealth violently from the unprepared to the ready. That's not ideology. It's observable historical fact. And while assets matter, capabilities matter more. Throughout history, the ultimate protection has been the ability to create value regardless of circumstance. The farmer who can grow food. The doctor who can treat illness. The carpenter who can build shelter. The mechanic who can repair machinery. The teacher who can educate. These people don't just survive collapse. They thrive in it. Because even when currency becomes worthless and institutions fail, production retains meaning. People still need food, shelter, health, and knowledge. Those who can provide these things are never without value. That's the deepest protection. Not gold or property alone, though those help. But the combination of useful skills, tangible assets, and the psychological preparation to recognize when systems are failing before collapse becomes obvious. Every crisis is a wealth transfer. From the trusting to the skeptical. From paper to reality. From consumers to producers. The pattern has repeated across every civilization and every century. So the question isn't whether everything falls apart. History proves it does. The question is whether you'll be left holding promises when they break or holding value when promises fail. The survivors of Weimar weren't the most patriotic. The survivors of the Depression weren't the most optimistic. The survivors of Soviet collapse weren't the most loyal. They were the ones who recognized fragility before it became catastrophe and acted accordingly. History doesn't repeat, but if you ignore its lessons, The next collapse will treat you exactly like it treated the trusting millions before you. If this changed how you see your own security, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.